Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 8 lecture focusing on probation and community correction supervision. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the types of probation that are available, the frequency in receiving probation as a sentence, and who most commonly receives probationary sentences. Although this is going to be a short lecture, remember that probation is a large part of the criminal justice system. More defendants are currently on community supervision than are incarcerated in facilities. So let's get started exploring probation. So remember from our discussion on probation and parole earlier in the semester that probation is a separate and distinct sentence, whereas parole is the continuation of a prison sentence where an inmate can serve the remainder of that prison sentence while living in the community. If I am sentenced to probation, that sentence can be imposed in one of two ways. First of all, I can receive a straight sentence. This means that I am only sentenced to probation and will not be incarcerated first. Instead, this is an indicator that my crime was not that serious or that my status as a first-time offender may have helped me during my sentencing process. If I am not receiving a straight sentence, then the other option is to receive a consecutive or a split sentence. This means that I will first complete my prison sentence. Normally, this is going to be without the option of parole. Once I am released from my incarceration sentence, then I will begin my probation sentence. The state is concerned about my ability to be in the community without supervision post-incarceration, and it still wants to keep tabs on me, but remember that parole is not an option anymore. That's where the probation sentence kicks in. Because the federal government and the majority of states no longer have parole for all offender groups, some individuals are sentenced to probation after their incarceration sentence as a way to keep track of them once they are released from prison. But in order to do this, the court has to sentence the offender to both an incarceration sentence and a probation sentence at the time of their sentencing. They have to be delivered simultaneously. This chart shows recent probation sentences that were assigned for split probation sentences given at the state level. You'll see that the blue line represents time in prison, and the orange is a secondary sentence for those individuals who have spent time on probation. So first, these individuals are spending X number of months in prison, and then upon release from incarceration, they are then spending X number of months on probation. So if you look at this chart, for example, you'll see that for basic murder charges, obviously these are not first-degree or capital murder offenders, an individual is going to receive about a 21-year sentence, and then after release, they're going to spend about 6 more years of probation upon release from their incarceration facility. Let's also take a look at, let's say, drug trafficking. For drug trafficking, you're going to receive about a 4-year prison sentence and then about another 3 years spent on probation after that. While on probation, most probationers have to abide by the standard conditions that are set forth by the court and by their probation officers. But like we discussed during the lecture on pretrial supervision, these conditions can change based on the type of offender and the type of crime that was committed. You'll notice that these are about the same conditions that were on the bond release that we reviewed when we were talking about pretrial supervision. The continuity is important here. Not only does it give the offender a level of stability, but it also keeps the different agencies in agreement with one another. The offender will then know what he or she might always have to abide by whatever certain condition has been imposed on that offender. So for example, if I received a curfew during my pretrial supervision, it's probably likely that I'm going to have a curfew while I am on probation. Even though there are a list of general conditions that most probationers have to abide by, some offenders are restricted even further with more punitive conditions. These go above and beyond what the standard conditions require, and they don't necessarily apply to all offenders. Some of them require punitive conditions and some of them do not. Not everyone is given the same conditions either. For example, sex offenders. Let's talk about them for a second. Sex offenders are not allowed to live near areas where children congregate, such as schools, bus stops, playgrounds, daycares, etc. These residency restrictions are mostly part of the state sex offender registry programs, but they also qualify as a punitive probation condition. Even when you are no longer on probation supervision, you will still need to abide by this one. But by having this overlap, it allows for the probationer to be violated by their probation officer, and it also allows the state to file new charges for a crime against the offender. It is a double whammy, but it is not double jeopardy. Often, sex offenders receive other types of punitive conditions from the state. For example, they might be limited to no contact with their victim. If they had a minor victim, they might not be allowed to live in the same house with the minor, regardless if that minor was their victim. And if they are a child porn offender, then they will probably not be allowed to use the internet. For non-sex offender probationers, there are a few other types of punitive conditions that may apply. Things like home confinement, electronic monitoring, curfew, and community service are often considered punitive conditions that go above and beyond the standard conditions that apply. There are quite a few different probation styles that are listed in your book, but I just want to discuss a few in depth here, and I want to continue on with our discussion of sex offender probation. Sex offender probation is more difficult in terms of the level of supervision comparative to other offenders, because this is a group of offenders that are not very trusted at any level of correctional supervision. If they are child porn probationers, for example, everyone is checking to make sure they don't have any access to a computer or a smartphone or a gaming console, really anything that has an internet-capable connection present. They don't want them to have internet access, because they don't want them to get more child porn, but they also have to be checked for hard copy child porn, because it's not all electronic. If they are contact offenders, for example, the probation officer is probably checking to make sure that they're staying away from vulnerable groups like young children. They often have to go to treatment for their sexual compulsions, something that many of them may not want to do or may not want to acknowledge. If they are required to attend treatment, that reluctance might not matter because the violation of probation is a larger looming issue. In general, they are given more leniency, or less leniency rather, than other types of offenders because of the severity of their offenses. For example, if a drug offender shows up to a probation office and provides a dirty UA, then that's really only hurting the individual. As a probation officer, I might be willing to let the probationer have another chance, and I might not violate them on their very first dirty UA. Drug users are almost expected to fail once or twice due to the nature of drug use and trying to kick an addiction. But if I am found out past my curfew as a sex offender probationer, revocation is more likely because the thought process might be that I was out trying to find another victim, and that's not something that we're really willing to take a chance on a second time. The lenience is simply not there. However, sex offenders are more closely watched because they have to abide by two sets of conditions, both probation and the sex offender registry requirements. Most of these are going to overlap with one another, as we discussed with residency restrictions. For example, like with other offenders, my probation officer says that I must get a job. But the state sex offender registry laws state that I can't get a job working with or working near children. That eliminates a lot of possible jobs for me. I cannot work at a daycare, I can't work as a teacher, or as a doctor, or as a nurse, or as anything else where I might come into direct contact with children in a professional capacity. Next up, we have intensive supervised probation, or ISP supervision. This is normally given to individuals who have committed more severe or more serious offenses, are considered high-risk probationers, or those who are more likely to violate the conditions of their probation. These probationers are placed under high levels of supervision. They must check in with their PO more often. They have to show up for more UA testing more frequently. They might have a more strict curfew. They could be on EM monitoring. They have more home visits, or their PO may show up at their place of employment. It is a tough form of supervision. There are more conditions that they have to comply with, and revocation is more likely because it's a lot easier for these individuals to mess up. Since the POs have smaller caseloads, they're better able to supervise these types of probationers. This form of probation is a little more costly than other less restricted types of probation, simply because it costs more money to oversee the probationer and to make sure that he or she is complying with all of their set conditions. But even with this type of supervision, it still can be at times more cost effective than incarceration. Juvenile probation is by far the most popular sentence that these minors can be sentenced to. It is almost a compromise sentence for these juveniles who may have not committed really serious offenses and are not yet considered chronic offenders. It allows for the juvenile to be supervised in the community, and it avoids the harshness that institutionalization provides. There are juvenile probation officers who supervise these young offenders. There are still probation conditions present, but they are adapted to the needs of the juvenile. Instead of maintaining a job, for instance, juveniles are required to attend school and to not skip. But everything that must occur for adult probation has to occur with juvenile probation too. Probation officers are required to conduct a PSI in order to determine the proper sentence. They must provide treatment services and other help to the juvenile offender. They must supervise them, and they have to make sure that they're not violating their conditions. If they are violating the terms of their probation, then the probation officer can revocate the probationer. A trend in juvenile probation is the development of intensive supervision probation programs just like that are present for adults. In these ISP programs for juveniles, the juvenile could be sentenced to home confinement in addition to their probation. The use of home confinement, employing electronic monitoring of juvenile offenders, does have some attractive advantages. It eases the problem of detention overcrowding. It also allows youth to participate in counseling, education, or vocational programs without endangering public safety. It allows youth to live with supervision in a more natural environment than they would receive in an institution. It also allows court workers to better assess the ability of youth to live in a community under the standard probation after they leave the ISP program. But this is indicative of a punishment, or is it indicative of a sanction? We know that juvenile probation can occur before the adjudication is made. So, if the probation takes place pre-adjudication, then this is really a form of diversion, right? Think about pre-adjudication juvenile probation in the framework of diversion as we discussed it in the previous chapter, and it will make a lot more sense. Let's take a moment to talk about officers and their caseloads. Think back once again to our lecture on pretrial supervision. These statistics on officers match pretty closely to the officer caseloads at the pretrial level for individual officers based on location and the office size. Why do you think that these match up so well? In many areas, the probation and pretrial officers work in the same department in a combined fashion. If that's the case, these officers are supervising the defendant before and after their conviction from the same city in the same office. It is not surprising that the caseloads are similar in size, if that's taken into regard. Like jails and prisons, the larger cities and areas have more people to supervise. If an officer has a specialized caseload, then they may have a smaller number of offenders to supervise. But if they are not a specialist and they're just supervising any and all probationers that make their caseload, then their supervision numbers may be higher. The downside to these large supervision numbers comes in the amount of time that can be dedicated to each individual probationer. If you have a caseload of 100 probationers, there simply isn't enough time to call everyone each week, and you don't have enough time for those individuals to all come into the office. It's going to be everything that you do for the entirety of your job. So instead, when there are large caseloads, officers turn to automated or bank supervision for at least part of their caseload. This requires the probationer to call into an automated phone bank and report into the probation officer via a recorded message. The officer can then review who has called in and who has not. This is typically used for lower risk offenders and can alleviate some of the time constraints for the officer. Probation can be used for a variety of different offenders and can occur at both the state and federal level. But individuals can be sentenced to probation for a variety of different offenses, ranging from murder to something as simple as theft. But of course, you have to remember that for the higher level, more severe crimes like murder, the offender would probably be facing prison time before they began their probation sentence. If we have a low-level offense, then there might be a higher reliance on the automated or banked probation that we just discussed in the last slide. Like I said earlier, this is used for those offenders who are low risk and typically nonviolent. I gave you the example of bald eagle feather laws. As you may know, bald eagles are a protected animal, and it can be a federal offense if you possess or you sell or you try to buy or transport a bald eagle or bald eagle eggs or even their nest. These laws can cover hunting the birds as well or trying to capture them, but that's for the actual bird itself. So I give you the example of the feather laws. What happens when you just take a feather? Well, federal laws also cover their feathers. You don't even have to take a feather for the bird itself to be prosecuted. There can be a bald eagle feather laying on the ground, and if you pick it up and take it with you, then you can be prosecuted under federal law. The law only allows for individuals who are members of or who have certifiable American Indian ancestry to be exempt from this law. But those individuals have to be registered as part of a legally recognized tribe in order to obtain the feathers. Otherwise, you can be fined up to $25,000 and receive a probationary sentence if you are not a member of a recognized tribe. If you actually do something to the eagle, then you could be facing larger fines and an actual prison sentence. So why am I talking about bald eagles here? Because possession of a bald eagle feather is really not all that dangerous. You're not going to go to jail or prison, it's very unlikely, and instead you're going to be fined and put on probation for a short amount of time. But my point here is that it's unlikely that these individuals will be at risk for reoffending. They're not going to be likely to violate the terms of their probation. So in this instance, it's very likely that these individuals will be perfect for automated probation because they don't have high levels of criminality. But not all probationers are as easy to supervise as our bald eagle feather probationers. If the offender is on probation for more violent or more serious offenses, we see that there are more risk involved and that the probationers are more likely to have issues while on active supervision. In addition to regular technical violations that stem from a violation of the probation conditions, research suggests that probationers are frequently being arrested for new offenses, they're being reconvicted for those offenses, and they're oftentimes being reincarcerated for those offenses as well. This is troubling because once again, we're seeing the revolving door at work. Those individuals who have committed felony offenses in the past are likely to do the same things again very shortly after committing their previous offenses. So when we're looking at programs and punishment, we always want to evaluate our efforts to see if we're doing things effectively. And when we're evaluating probation in terms of effectiveness, we have to ask the question, does probation work? At a basic level, that answer would be yes. It does work, but it doesn't always work, and it doesn't work for everybody. Effectiveness for probation could be measured in terms of recidivism. Has the offender reoffended? Has the offender been rearrested or even reconvicted for an offense? Based on how you measure recidivism, that answer could differ quite a bit. But at the base level, we can see that the majority of offenders do complete their probation sentences successfully. This means that they have not recidivated overall. Technical violations don't necessarily count, but overall they are not committing new crimes while they are on active supervision. However, we know based on the previous slide and the previous research that the majority of these offenders are misdemeanant or low-level felony offenders. The more severe your offense, the more likely it is that you will not complete your probation sentence successfully. Misdemeanant probationers are persons who have committed an isolated conviction. They have and their criminal record really constitutes a low-level type of offense, and this sort of makes it relatively easy for them to complete a probationary sentence. For felony probationers or offenders with a very extensive criminal history, the results are far less impressive. So if our misdemeanant probationers have the best chance of successfully completing their probation, who then has the worst chance of successfully completing their probation? Look at this list of characteristics for those individuals who are less successful. You'll see that some of them are going to match our previous discussion on criminality. We can see that those who struggle the most are typically young, unemployed, unmarried men with prior criminal records who have longer probation sentences. These are the individuals who are less successful with their probation. This is not much of a deviation from our prior work on criminality. Even if you have some people who fail to successfully complete their probation, and even if you have some probationers who violate their conditions, overall, research consistently finds that probation supervision is drastically cheaper than incarceration. Not all offenders need to be incarcerated, but by sentencing some to probation, we can see that the system is working in some small part to alleviate the overcrowding issue and to keep the waste of resources to a minimum. Even if you sentenced a offender to ISP supervision, we can see that the cost is higher than regular probation, but in some instances it's still much cheaper than incarceration. The cost and the less restrictive nature of probation make it desirable for offenders, and the system can use it almost as an incentive during plea agreements if that plea agreement for probation is applicable to the specific offender. Finally, I want to discuss the effectiveness of ISP supervision. We know that ISP supervision is more restrictive than regular probation, and it places more conditions on the probationer than regular probation supervision does. There have been some criticisms about whether or not ISP supervision is just setting the offender up to fail because it is difficult for some to comply with all of the requirements of this type of offender supervision. Even if ISP supervision is considered to be more strenuous than regular supervision, it is still easier than being in prison comparatively. Without the availability of probation, more offenders would opt for trial, which would secure far fewer convictions rather than the police system, and it would backlog the criminal justice system and the courts even more than they are now. So even if the ISP supervision does have some flaws, and it does, it certainly provides us a useful service for the overall system. In an evaluation of ISP supervision, Joan Petersilia found 4 significant themes that are associated with the use of this supervision program. First, she identified that ISP supervision is used as an enhancement program for regular probation. Because you're asking more of your probationers, you're anticipating a greater level of failure, and we see that happen. There are just more people who are violating when you have more avenues for violation. That's an expected finding just based on the nature of this supervision. But she also evaluated whether or not it was cost effective. She determined that it might not always be as cost effective as we hoped it would be. Even though the supervision itself might be cheaper, if we end up having to spend more money overall because you deal with the revocation problem from the violations, sending people back to jail because you revoked them, then we see more costs being associated with these revocations rather than just the strict supervision. But it's not all bad news. Petersilia determined that ISP supervision programs had the ability to restore some credibility to the CJ system overall. This means that if you're going to use ISP supervision, then you're going to have to do it right. It can't just be about the tough conditions that you're trying to implement on your probationer. You have to impose the conditions, but you also have to provide a treatment option to go with it. It can't just be about the supervision. Research shows that if you combine treatment programs with sanctions, then you have better outcomes overall for your offenders rather than just being harsh and strict with them. The severity of the sanctions alone makes them want to recidivate more and more. But providing a positive goal and the possibility of success does not set the offender up for automatic failure. Finally, Petersilia suggests that an overall balance does the job right. If you can include all of these things and get the offender to comply, then you're going to end up with a successful program. Her review of well-balanced programs shows that if programs include all of these things, you can end up with a successful reduction of rearrest rates for ISP probationers by at least 10 to 20% overall. That reduction then can in turn help with the cost effectiveness issue that we just addressed on the last slide. Overall, this lecture shows a kind of a brief glance at life on probation. We have to recognize that there are millions of offenders currently on active supervision throughout the country at both the state and the federal level who are serving sentences in the community rather than being incarcerated. Because of the sheer volume of offenders who are out there, we have to make sure that our probation programs are working and are effective. If they aren't effective in trying to reduce violations and recidivism, then why are we still doing the same ineffective things over and over again in hopes that one day they just might magically start working? In the next lecture, we're going to focus our attentions once again to institutional corrections and see what life is like while incarcerated in a prison facility for a long-term prison sentence. Meet me back here next time when we take a look at life as a prison inmate. I will see you all then.